Buongiorno, everybody. Let me try to give you a very broad overview of India's relationship with the European Union, how it has evolved over the years, the major perceptions, and then try to focus on touching on some fundamental issues, especially very important recent developments, some of which were referred to by the professor. Now, in terms of a very short overview, India took a very keen interest in the European community from the very beginning that it was established in 1957. But its initial perceptions of the European Economic Community were a mixture of both fear and hope. A fear of the unknown, mixed with the hope that as the community became economically strong and powerful, it would not grow into a self-centered, inward-looking economic giant. At the same time, India realized and recognized the economic importance of the newly established community. And therefore, it was the first Asian country to establish diplomatic relations as early as March 1962, and the first non-associate member country to sign the Commercial Cooperation Agreement in 1973. During the Cold War, however, relations with India were of marginal importance for Brussels, especially for two reasons. Number one, South Asia was traditionally considered a British domain, a monopoly of the British, because Britain had ruled India for over 200 years. And it was seen as a complex region of Asia, which had a broad variety of problems which seemed insoluble. However, with the end of the Cold War, the European Economic Community, which became the European Union in 1993, no longer looked at India through the Cold War lens. At the same time, India too had shed much of its ideological baggage of the policy of non-alignment and began to accord greater priority to the West, including Europe and the European Union as a market, as a source of technology and foreign direct investment. This was also a time when India launched a historic policy of liberalization to overcome its rate, the Hindu rate of growth growing at about 3.5%. And from the early 1990s onwards, India sought to engage the European community, sought an upgraded dialogue, and the West in general, including the European Union, moved higher up in its scale of foreign policy priorities. And India at this time had become the large market that India offered, had become increasingly interesting because of its economic reforms and liberalization policies. It was at the turn of the century, at the initiative of the Portuguese presidency, that annual summits between India and the European Union began. And a strategic partnership was established in 2004, followed the next year by a joint action plan. Now, remember that this is the only joint action plan that India has with any country or regional organization at all. Between 2000 and 2012, these summits were held annually. However, no summit was held between 2013 and 2015 owing to the Italian Marines issue. This was an incident when a number of Indian fishermen were killed by Italian guards aboard a ship, and legal proceedings and other things, delayed. So when Prime Minister Modi expressed a desire to visit Brussels for the summit in 2015, but the High Representative at that time, Federica Mogherini, refused to confirm dates largely because of displeasure over the Italian Marines issue. So it was only in 2016 that the 13th India-EU summit took place, leading to the adoption of an Agenda for Action 2020. There were no summits in 2016 and 2017, but there were summits in 2016 and 2017, but no summits were held in 2018 and 2019, largely because of elections in India and to the European Parliament. Now, in 2020, an ambitious roadmap to 2025 was adopted. And a few months ago, in May 2021, for the first time, at the 16th India-EU Summit, a video conference was held with all the 27 heads of state or government of the European Union. This was unique, not only in symbolic terms, but also it signified the changing tenor of relations between the two entities. Now, let me talk a bit about perception, which will give you a better idea. Now, first of all, we have to realize that Indian perceptions of modern Europe have been the result of specific historical experience of a cultural and colonial encounter with the West. The fact that India was a colony of the UK for over 200 years definitely colored India's perceptions and its foreign policy perspectives, especially during the Cold War, where India maintained a policy of non-alignment. And since there was at this time a selective admiration of Europe, after independence, that is in 1947, Anglo-American imagery in the Indian media basically conditioned the Indian elite's perceptions of Europe. And this, on the whole, tended to reinforce, strengthen, sustain the stereotypical images and cliches about Europe. For example, France as a land of food, wine, and fashion. Switzerland as the paradise for reform, because Indian films, they portrayed this very often, that was the destination for honeymoon, etc., etc. Or German cars as consumer brands. But for the most part, for most Indians, Europe largely remained a strange land and an exotic place for tourism, to which only a privileged layer of society had access until recently. Today, of course, is a different scene. Pre-pandemic is a different scene altogether, because you see groups of Indians all across Europe, especially during the summer, at key tourist spots, from Paris to Rome to Prague and so on and so forth. So for many decades, for many Indians, Europe remained largely a strange land. The European Union in particular was a complex and strange economic and political collectivity. And generally speaking, the average Indian confronted the 3 Ds when it came to the European Union. It was distant. It was not like the friendly neighborhood South Asian Association for Regional Cooperation. It was difficult. It was difficult to understand, and I believe Madeleine Albright once said that you either had to be a French or a genius to understand the European Union. And we Indians were far away, several thousand miles away. It was very difficult for Indians to understand the complexity of the European Union as an international regional organization. And it was different. It was different, distant, difficult. So the 3 Ds was what the average Indian generally tended to view the European Union. And historically, since India had close links with the Anglo-Saxons, this essentially restricted interaction with continental Europe, which even till today, remains not that substantial. There was another problem by over-reliance on the Anglo-Saxon media, because the yellow British press has consistently prevented a very nuanced understanding of the processes and dynamics of European integration, as well as the intricacies and role of various EU institutions. In fact, there has been virtually no interest at all in the nitty-gritty of the internal evolution, transformation, and working of difficult EU institutions. Now, over the decades that I've been trying to understand the European Union, I would say that there are 3 kinds of people in the EU when it comes to India and South Asia. In the first category are those who are otherwise very well informed and knowledgeable, but who make no attempt to understand South Asia because they feel that others have tried it and failed. Then there are those who understand nothing and desire to understand nothing because they feel India is simply too complex and too far away. And between these 2 categories, there is a growing third category, a minority, which has the courage and perseverance to make an effort to understand the more complex problems of India and wished to do something about it. So therefore, for many decades, since the 1950s, late 1950s, there has been a huge information deficit between India and the European Union. We simply know very little about each other. And this is largely the result of mutual indifference and neglect. Now, as I said earlier, India has a strategic partnership with the European Union. This is one of the 32 that India has worldwide, and the sixth in Europe. The other countries being the UK, France, Germany, and most recently you have Denmark, with which we have a green strategic partnership, and the Netherlands this year, with which we have a water partnership. Now, in the early 2000s, three elements bound India and the EU together. Firstly, India looked upon a more integrated and united Europe as a relatively independent international actor, which was in keeping with its image of and preference for a more multipolar world, where India was viewed as an emerging power. Secondly, there were a lot of similarities between India and the multi-ethnic, multi-religious, multicultural, multilingual, plural democracy like the European Union. And the third factor was that because Europe was like an island of tranquility in a sea of turbulence around it, India was seen as an anchor of stability. Now, in the 2010s, India focused. There was a sort of a downslide in relations between India and the European Union for a number of reasons. Firstly, the sovereign debt crisis, which compelled Europe to become more inward-looking, to resolve its problems with the inherent genetic defects of monetary integration, and the fact that a number of South European countries were facing, severe economic problems. Now, this inward-looking European Union and the succession of crises which followed thereafter led the relationship between India and the European Union to lose much of its momentum. And this was largely for three reasons. Number one, as I said, Europe became inward-looking. And as a result of this, it lost a lot of its unity in projecting a European voice on major global and regional issues. Secondly, with the rise of China, virtually every EU member state and the European Union began to focus intensively in China, which emerged as an economic powerhouse, which they felt could perhaps offer some way out of the severe economic and financial difficulties that the European Union confronted. And of course, the third reason was Brexit, which was seen in India as representing the further marginalization of the European Union. Now, then of course, as part of its inward-looking attitude, the European Union in the 2010s was focused to a great extent on its immediate neighborhoods. And this lack of momentum, lack of forward movement in India-EU relations was further aggravated by the lack of progress in the India-European Union Free Trade Agreement, which were stuck after 2013. And as I said earlier, in 2012, owing to the arrest of Italian Marines and the cumbersome legal process which went on, and because at that time, Federica Mogherini was the High Representative, that led to a period of coolness in bilateral relations. Nevertheless, the strategic partnership over the years has broadened to include politics, economics, climate change, energy, counterterrorism, maritime security, science and technology, civil society dialogue, renewable energy, urbanization, and so on and so forth. And there are nearly 30 sectoral dialogues that take place at various levels between India and the European Union. But at the same time, you have certain dialogue formats which were discontinued, like the India-EU Roundtable. This was a regular annual meeting of members of civil society. But this was launched in 2001, but this was not renewed after 2008. Similarly, India and the European Union have been having a human rights dialogue, but this was not held for 8 years. It's only now in 2021 that this was resumed after a gap of 8 years. The only major change was that though the EU Global Strategy of 2016 sought to redefine itself in the context of global disruptions and spoke about strategic autonomy and principled pragmatism in how it approached the emerging powers, but it actually took the coming into power of Narendra Modi as Prime Minister of India in 2014, which was viewed from the Europeans' point of view as significant. First of all, one major change introduced by the Modi administration was that there was clear recognition across the board that the expansion of comprehensive national power would be considerably facilitated by close cooperation with the West, including Europe and the European Union. And in fact, he placed great reliance on Europe and the European Union as indispensable partners to facilitate India's modernization, as access to technology, finance, best practices, because he launched a number of flagship programs like Make in India, Clean India, Smart Cities, etc., etc. Excuse me. Now, a major change was the EU's India Strategy 3.0, the 2018 India Strategy after a gap of 14 years. Because the earlier communication was a 2004 communication on the strategic partnership, and this sought to define the EU's priorities with India for the next decade and recognized that a strong partnership with India was a key for a more balanced EU policy towards Asia as a whole. Because until this strategy, everybody said that EU's Asia strategy was basically a policy towards China. Now, this strategy outlined 66 proposed actions around two major pillars, that is sustainable modernization and security and stability through a rules-based global order. Okay, now let me come to the rise of China. Now, the rise of China has risen. It is already ascendant. It is the second most significant economic entity in the world after the United States. It is virtually the leading trade partner of virtually every country around the globe. Now, when we had the summit in October 2017, there was greater convergence between India and the European Union because the earlier European romanticism, that greater engagement, that by facilitating the rise of China, this would eventually lead to internal democratic reform and the gradual acceptance of Western values. Now, this mirage, this chimera, soon vanished with the very major inroads that the Belt and Road Initiative made in Europe. The earlier romantic notions that China would be a responsible stakeholder in world politics, these hopes remained unfulfilled. So initially, while India, when the first Belt and Road Initiative conference was held in Beijing in 2017, India was viewed as the sole critic of the BRI, but very soon its criticism was shared by Europe, Japan, and the United States. Now, the COVID-19 pandemic has exacerbated, has worsened the drawbacks of the existing world order, which the United States created and maintained for 7 decades. Now, severe setbacks came as a result of the election of Donald Trump, his transactional policies, his lowering of Europe in its priorities, his criticism of Europe's inability to bear the adequate defense burdens and responsibilities. And in fact, he undermined the existing world order in several ways. So the pandemic highlighted the declining legitimacy of international institutions as a result of politicization, manipulation, a lack of representation, and independent leadership and purpose. The pandemic also meant that Pax Americana had definitely passed away. One also began to witness social and governance vulnerabilities in the West. That is, you had the rise of illiberal regimes across Europe. You found that the divide between North and South Europe over economics was increasing. And there was a growing divide between Western and Eastern Europe over values. Some Polish politicians even said that a new Berlin Wall had come up between Eastern Europe and Western Europe. So many Indian thinkers felt that the pandemic was leading the world to a smaller, meaner kind of world because many states were turning inwards, becoming greatly critical of globalization. There was a search of autonomy and a desire to control one's own fate. Now, in recent years, let's say the past 3 years or so, there has been a profound change in India's perceptions, perspectives, and priority that it has given to Europe. This has been, of course, the result of the erratic behavior of the Trump administration, the rise and growing assertiveness of China, which seeks to step into this vacuum. Brexit has had a profound impact, and the widespread danger to a rule-based world order. Now, all these factors led India to re-engage Europe with Greater Europe. Another major change was that India, which had earlier viewed the European Union as a somewhat undervalued partner, saw a great growth in the number of conversations which India was having with Europe in fields like economy, technology, standards, best practices, development, defense, security. Not only with the European Union, but with many more member states, and that India was no longer prioritizing merely on the big three, France, Germany, and the United Kingdom. Now, this renewed re-engagement or rediscovery of Europe is actually the result of changing geopolitics, India's own evolving and changing priorities, and the growing relevance of Europe and the European Union in the post-Brexit era. It is also the result of China's expanding footprint on the European continent and a direct result of its search for alternatives for the loss of the UK as a market and #1 investment destination. Now, all these developments which I've just mentioned, they have compelled India to revisit, re-examine, and rethink its own policies towards Europe and its search for alternatives to Britain. This realization has meant that India is more proactively engaging the Nordic countries as well as Central and Eastern Europe, which hitherto received very little attention, largely because of lack of historical ties, especially after the breakup of the Soviet Union in 1991, weak people-to-people links, and marginal economic cooperation. So one change you found was that in April 2018, India held its first summit with the 5 Nordic countries. The second Nordic summit is going to be held next year under the Danish presidency. And I think perhaps the most important change you see is this renewed focus on Central and Eastern Europe, which had actually received inadequate attention from the government, the media, and the scholarly community. And this might see very soon the emergence of a strategic partnership with the Czech Republic, which is presently under discussion. And incidentally, it might interest you to know that Czech Republic is the first Central European country to open a separate window for inviting over 500 skilled Indian professionals for long-term residence permits in the Czech Republic. Okay, now let's talk a little bit about the post-war liberal order and how the European Union and India approach it. You see, the post-war rule-based liberal order was based on the belief on the importance of democracy, markets, and respect for the rule of law, which was essentially maintained by the United States. But one found that there was a growth of economic and cultural anxiety of an aging population in Europe, which in certain ways rejected many of 20th century liberal principles, especially globalization. So what one witnessed was that in varying degrees, varying from country to country, Western states were exhibiting a reduced commitment to globalization, multilateralism, and preserving the liberal international order. China's growth ambition. In fact, China was viewed as the greatest normative challenger, the post-war liberal order. There were fears that the Beijing consensus might replace the Washington consensus. And, as a risen power seeking equality with the United States, Chinese exceptionalism and behavior towards the South China Sea was clearly seen as violating established international norms and practices. And there was a growing feeling that the Chinese, in many ways, were seeking to replace the liberal order by a Chinese-led order based on Chinese interests. Now, let me refer briefly, before I talk about, concentrate on 3 major elements of the past few years, which have given greater momentum, life to the India-EU relationship. Let me briefly refer to the Indian AU FTA, or the Broad Trade and Investment Agreement. Now, between 2007 and April 2013, when negotiations broke off, about 90% of the issues relating to trade issues had been basically resolved. But the deadlock arose because of certain EU concerns regarding high tariffs on cars, which were very important from the German point of view, wines, which were very important from the French point of view, and of course, the British were unhappy about Scotch because India is one of the highest consumers of Scotch. So that became one very sticking point with the British, apart from the second point about allowing skilled professionals entry into the European Union under Mod 4. Plus, there were sticking points about greater access to banking, retail, legal services in India, geographical indications, and public procurement, because there is a very large public procurement, state and central government market. From India's point of view, they sought greater liberalization in terms of the movement of professionals, market access for agricultural products, pharmaceuticals, and textiles. Though negotiations broke off in April 2013, but a number of meetings were held thereafter between chief negotiators, several stock-taking meetings, with the last one being held in July 2019. Now let me come to the last 3 years or so. Now here you find 3 new elements in the India-EU relationship. First is the connectivity partnership. Second is the recommencement of negotiations on the trade and investment agreement, and they are likely to be formally begin in December 2021. Of course, I mean, you're free to ask me questions about whether there is going to be any easy solution to the sticking points which broke off the earlier negotiations. But apparently it seems that both sides have realized that, though there is formally an emphasis on comprehensive negotiations, but apparently, there seems to be a meeting of the minds about, that what kind of compromises the two sides are willing to make, to facilitate an agreement. And of course, the third key element has been that in September, as the professor was referring to, there is now an EU Indo-Pacific strategy. Now, first, let me talk briefly about the connectivity strategy. The EU was not the first, an Indo-Pacific strategy was first of all, enunciated by the French, which was followed by a number of other European countries, Germany, the Netherlands. And it is only now in September that the EU has come out with the Indo-Pacific strategy. But first of all, let me talk about the connectivity partnership. Now, though this is being projected as a kind of an alternative to the Belt and Road Initiative, it is anything but that. The EU-India Connectivity Partnership was launched in May 2021 as a follow-up to the 2018 Connecting Europe and Asia strategy of the European Union. Now, the idea behind this is basically to cooperate in third countries, especially Africa. And incidentally, I might mention that India and Japan also have a strategy like this called the Asia Growth Perspective, where they're also looking at Africa to launch joint projects. Now, the areas which have been identified in the connectivity partnership are digital, transport, energy, people-to-people connectivity. The idea is to build on, let's say, India's strengths in the IT field. Financing is expected to partially originate from European and Indian public agencies, but great stress is being laid on raising finance from private sources. Of course, they are keen, both sides emphasize certain key elements of this connectivity partnership, issues like sustainability, transparency, fairness, etc., which are therefore sharply distinct from those of the BRI. Now, let me talk a bit about the Indo-Pacific. As I said, the European Union reluctantly introduced the Indo-Pacific Strategy, and it sort of became evident that it would come out soon, especially after Germany, announced its Indo-Pacific Strategy. Now, the reason why this has been done is because the Indo-Pacific is seen as an increasingly strategically important region for the European Union, for its economic, demographic, political weight. And it's seen as increasingly, as seen as an important role it can play in addressing global challenges. Now, the European Union states that it is, it's already the top investor, the leading development cooperation partner, and one of the biggest trading partners in the Indo-Pacific region. In fact, the Indo-Pacific and the Europe, they hold 70% of global trade in goods and services, as well as 60% of foreign direct investment. Now, this strategy basically highlights 7 principles. Some of them are sustainable and inclusive prosperity, green transition, connectivity, human security, and so on. But the emphasis of the Indo-Pacific strategy is on the soft sectors. Like promoting an open and rules-based regional security architecture, including ensuring secure sea lanes of communication, especially given China's bid to interdict commerce by its building activities in the South China Sea. The EU also seeks to enhance capacity building. But for its enhanced naval presence, the EU essentially relies on member states because the EU itself does not have independent military capability of its own. The strategy also seeks to conduct more joint exercises, port calls, including multilateral exercises. In fact, India has held one recently with the EU naval forces a few months ago. So as I said, this is mostly in soft areas, and not in terms of hard security, because the European Union basically has very limited capabilities of its own in this area and has therefore no choice but to rely on member states. Amongst member states, it's only France, which has a natural role in the region, and to a certain extent, the UK. Germany has only recently participated by sending a warship to the region, but they are generally likely to keep a very low profile. Now, coming to the question mark, which is there at the theme of the lecture, are India and the European Union going towards greater convergence? For the first time in the October 2017 joint statement, India and the European Union called each other natural partners. In terms of, and this was qualified by stating that it was in terms of shared values and beliefs. Now, all concerned regard this as, rhetoric, but there are fundamental differences. This 2017 statement for the first time saw the two entities agreeing on a number of things. On a rule-based international order, on North Korea, on Iran. But at the same time, one should mention that there are a number of areas of divergence. Despite the new momentum which has been seen in the past few years, we can say that it is very correct to state that India and the European Union have not been able to transform shared values into shared interest and shared priorities when it comes to practical cooperation. Why is this? The basic reason is because, again, until recently, there was a big disconnect in worldviews, mindsets, and practical agendas. And there was also, depending on some years, considerable mutual indifference. So what you see that both sides naturally perceived each other through the lens of their own experience, two different cultures, two different belief systems. And, we have to remember that despite growing momentum in political and geopolitical perspectives and similarities on many issues, some of the fundamental differences between India and Europe will remain because they are at two different levels of economic and social development, and because they have two different histories and milieus. I for example, one area which we can discuss later is climate change, where though the Indian narrative is changing considerably, because India considers itself as a country most fundamentally affected by climate change, but there are differences on certain issues. So therefore, the two entities are bound to have different geographical and geopolitical perspectives and priorities, though, as I said, there is growing convergence on some issues in recent years. There are, for instance, differences on globalization, on the role and profile of the International Criminal Court, etc. Now, one area where there are differences between India and the European Union, and there is divergence, is the quest of India for a permanent seat on the United Nations Security Council. Now, emerging powers like India argue that the structures of global governance must be made more democratic, representative, and legitimate to reflect current geopolitical and economic realities. The world of 2021 is not the world of 1944. And these changes must be reflected in the global political and economic architecture. But what one finds is that the political and security architecture remains virtually frozen in time. And this is the case with the most exclusive club in mankind's history, namely the UN Security Council. Now, the problem is the EU has not been able to formulate a common position on the enlargement of the UN Security Council because of internal differences. The coffee club countries like Italy are opposed to the membership of Germany, and because of these internal differences and because of the need of unanimity in common foreign and security policy, especially on sensitive issues like this one, the EU has not been able to adopt a unified stand. But the key thing which I would like to push across to you is that India does not seek to replace international governance institutions with new institutions. All that it seeks is its legitimate position. It is knocking on the door so that it can have a bigger say in order to protect its interest as a growing, emerging power. Now, Professor, I don't know whether I should talk about climate change now or we should leave it to the discussion and I should move on to my conclusion.
Can you repeat, please, your question to me?
Do you want me to talk about climate change now, or shall I just come to the broad conclusion so that we can move on to the Q&A?
No. I think we can touch this issue, which is increasingly important.
Fine. Okay.
Also, yeah.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Now, you see, traditionally, India was viewed as a strong critique as a country which was resisting the momentum move towards making greater climate change efforts. But for many years, India's narrative has changed to a very great extent. Because India is going to be one of the major countries to be very strongly adversely affected by climate change. Now, India is currently the third largest emitter of greenhouse gases, but its emissions are 1/4 of that of China. And its per capita emission of greenhouse gases is amongst the lowest in the world. Now, you find two fundamental ways in which India looks at climate change. First of all, India views climate change more in developmental terms rather than environmental terms, because economic growth is the only way it can take millions out of poverty. And secondly, India argues that a distinction ought to be made between the survival emissions of a developing country in contrast to the lifestyle emissions of the West. Because India, like other developing countries, feel is that there is a lot of wasteful consumption of electricity, which contributes to greenhouse gases. Now, at the recent COP26 Glasgow Summit, which was held recently, India made a number of major commitments. One, that it would make a 1 billion ton reduction in projected emissions from now until 2030. Secondly, it would accelerate its renewable energy capacity by 2030 from the existing objective of 450 gigawatts to 500 gigawatts. Thirdly, that its share of renewable energy in its mix of electricity generation would increase by 50% to 50% by 2030 instead of the 40% it had declared at the Paris Climate Change Summit. And finally, which because many countries of the West and Europe were pressing India to come out with a net zero commitment. So finally, at this Glasgow summit, India said that it would agree to a net zero emissions target, setting 2070 as the target date by when to achieve it. But the key point is that significant progress worldwide would depend on two crucial things. Number one, the degree to which effective, meaningful technology transfer takes place from the north to the south. And secondly, how effectively concessional finance is made available. Now, these are the two ifs. Now, let me just come to the overall conclusions and then we can go to the Q&A. First of all, India is no longer perceived by the European Union through the perspective of development aid. Because in 2014, development aid stopped to India because India had graduated, to a different category altogether, and therefore it was no longer eligible for development aid. At the same time, India has emerged itself as a major development aid donor. In the past years, it has given as much as $8 billion in aid, to other countries. This, of course, does not mean that development assistance has not been repackaged. In fact, there are several portfolios in which development assistance is now given. For instance, for urbanization, for renewable energy, and for several metro projects in several major cities, which has seen big funding coming in from the European Investment Bank. There is also a degree of convergence between India and the European Union on issues like the elimination of weapons of mass destruction, prevention of terrorism, maritime security, dealing with health hazards and epidemics. So, of course, one should mention here that the Europeans remain quite reserved about removing IPR bans on COVID-19 vaccines, which is something which India and South Africa proposed, which has not been the case, which has not been forthcoming. Thirdly, I'd like to emphasize that the core relationship between India and the European Union will essentially remain economic and trade. Even though we are witnessing greater convergence on a growing number of geopolitical issues, and there is growing momentum in political relations, not only with, let's say, the European Union, but with a number of European countries, most recently, with Italy, which the Prime Minister visited recently. Why? Because Europe is viewed as a very important destination for cross-border investments, for overseas investments to facilitate inorganic growth. And this, in fact, has been, pushed, has gathered greater momentum after Brexit because, after Britain having left the European Union, Indian companies have to relocate to the European continent. Okay, so what we see is that the world today is in a period of profound change and uncertainty. The rise and growing assertiveness of China, a divided Europe on many issues, a re-emerging Russia, and the backlash against globalization, we see the world in a state of flux. So finally, the US-China geopolitical contest, it's not a Cold War, but there are frictions will continue. Europe increasingly sees China as a major cooperation partner, but at the same time, as a competitor and also as a systemic rival. So the uncertainties of a more turbulent world have made India and the European Union look towards each other as like-minded partners with similar values, a similar international perspective, and conformity to international law to strengthen multilateralism and a rule-based order. Okay, Professor, I think I will end with that and open myself to questions.
Okay, so thank you very much. Thank you very much for your lecture, for your talk. And now the floor is open to questions and to your comments. And you can use the chat, of course, and or you can take the mic of your devices, okay, of your devices. So as an icebreaker, as usual, the first question is mine, if I may, and it has to do with the South Asian Association of Regional Cooperation, which regional organizations established in the mid-80s in 1985, if I remember well, and including, of course, states and nations in South Asia, including India and, of course, Pakistan, Afghanistan, Sri Lanka, and so on and so forth. That is, my question is, what is, first of all, how is this regional organization, the state of health, in your opinion, of this regional organization? What is the relevance of this organization for India and for EU-India relations? This is my question.
Okay. Well, first of all, let me say the health of this regional organization is not very good. First of all, it is called the South Asian Association of Regional Cooperation. nowhere is the term regional integration used. Secondly, this regional organization was established in 1985, as you correctly said, on an initiative of Bangladesh. And for many years, this was seen as a kind of small states ganging up against the big bully, big country of the region, India, somewhat like, and the perceptions were somewhat different than Germany, because now South Asia remains the least integrated region of the world because less than 5% of their trade takes place amongst themselves. The problem is that while India has a border with each of these countries except Afghanistan, none of these countries have borders with each other. Now, this raises a lot of issues like migration problems, cross-border terrorism, etc., etc. The biggest problem, of course, has been that the state of relations between India and Pakistan has held the regional economic grouping to ransom because Pakistan takes the perspective that unless and until the issue of Kashmir is resolved, regional cooperation cannot proceed further. Now, India on its own has done two things. Number one, that it has taken several initiatives to, make larger sacrifices, like providing economic and tariff concessions to Bangladesh so it could have greater access to the economic market of India. At the same time, it has offered a SAARC satellite. There are several other initiatives. But the reaction of India has been that since regional cooperation within South Asia was not moving forward, India has looked to two things. One, sub-regional cooperation. So you have a number of sub-regional organizations like BIMSTEC, the Mekong grouping, and so on. And secondly, it has activated its, East Asia policy. You see that Asia has emerged as a leading partner, trade partner with India. And we have a free trade agreement with ASEAN. So India's focus has shifted elsewhere. Now, India would, for instance, to give you one example, India would like to have greater cooperation with Afghanistan, for instance, which is landlocked. But Pakistan has been denying access through land routes. So India has therefore to look to other alternatives like this port at Iran, and through a railway line then to get to Afghanistan. So overall, now the European Union began cooperating with India in several ways. I mean, they ran a number of technical cooperation projects, like strengthening the SAARC Secretariat, which is based in Kathmandu, Nepal. They also did some minor projects like controlling some rhinder pest, etc. But very soon they realized that, it was not regional cooperation as such, but became national cooperation projects with the various, South Asian countries. So therefore, not much is happening between the European Union and SAARC. And in fact, you see, one should not try to compare the European Union with SAARC because it's like comparing apples to oranges, because the two are historically, politically, geopolitically so different from each other. So all I can say is that one wishes that we could have more regional cooperation, but I think for the foreseeable future, it will remain the least economically integrated region in the world.
Okay, so thank you very much. There is a question from Vasily from Moscow. So
Yeah.
Vasily, can you take the mic and can you switch your camera? Possible? Okay, Vasily, please.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Professor Jain, for your lecture. It was very informative and thought-provoking. So my question is as follows. Well, I would like to start, if you don't mind, with a little bit from history. And we are taught at MGIMO University that one of the key, perhaps most crucial aspect of Indian foreign policy has been that it was able to find the golden mean between two rivalries, two blocks. I mean, the Soviet Union and the United States of America, China, United States of America, and it's actually what made it well, neutral in one case, and to take advantage from both sides and to evolve. And that's actually what makes India, well, a great power. Its wisdom, its well, possibility to find the golden mean, to balance. Well, today, as far as I see it, India is moving to more closer cooperation with the West, and Quad is a case in point, is a salient example of that. And the question is arising whether India still considers the such organizations or forum as BRICS, G20, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization among its foreign policy priorities. And well, sorry, perhaps this question is not about India-EU relations as a whole, but I couldn't but ask the professor from India about the issue that interests me a lot. Thank you very much.
No, thank you for the question, Vasily. Okay, the essential element of India's policy of non-alignment was independence of judgment and safeguarding of national interests. But when the Cold War ended, the question arose, who would you be non-aligned against, because the Soviet Union broke up in 1991. Now, there are two aspects, two ways which I'll answer your question. Number one, that, as the world has changed, India's foreign policy has also evolved with the passage of time. And you find three crucial elements. Number one is strategic autonomy. India was talking about this much before the European Union did. Strategic autonomy basically implies retaining flexibility in foreign policy decisions, in being pragmatic, and in moving with the times. Secondly, the second principle was multi-alignment, in the sense that you would form interest-based coalitions with like-minded countries, which would not mean alliance. Now, for instance, though our ties with the West have increased considerably, and that, as I sought to highlight in my lecture, was because, number one, India feels that its modernization would be more effectively done in cooperation with the West. And here I'm not talking about the West as an organic collectivity, but the United States, Europe, and so on and so forth, for technology, best practices, you name it, you find India more open-minded. The third thing which you find is you have a growing number of coalitions of the willing across the world, where like-minded countries are coming together on various issues. So, for instance, China is difficult for a large number of countries, but especially India, because we share a land boundary with China. So, as part of our hedging strategy, one seeks to improve relationships with Western countries. This does not mean that Russia, for instance, has ceased to be important for us, because even today, Russia is still the supplier of major components of our military hardware. For instance, like the S-400, expensive, worth several $1 billion, which we will start receiving next year. This we are continuing despite CATSA, the American threat of imposing sanctions. So, And this is not something which is unique to India. You find countries all across the world being very nimble-footed, very, very carefully reaching out to countries, forming alliances. And therefore, insofar as regional organizations, which you mentioned, the BRICS, G20. Now, since the G7 was not expanding, the G20 essentially became the club of leading countries, which since the sovereign debt crisis was dealing with most of the global problems, So India became, a valued partner of this new organization. Now, you have to understand one thing, as like the professor was asking, India belonged to the least integrated region of the world. So when India began since the early 1990s to look beyond South Asia, India wanted to become a member of any and every regional organization around the world. So, it's like our summits with ASEAN, it's becoming a member of the ASEAN Regional Forum, whether it is the SCO, whether it is BRICS, you name it, we want to be part of any grouping because, you gain from being inside the grouping rather than being outside the group. So all I can say is that, two things are most crucial for India today. Number one, trying to preserve an international environment which facilitates India's development. Because development is the only way which we can take millions out of poverty. Development is the only way which will, help us lead to a $5 trillion economy from a $3 trillion economy today and gain greater respect and weight in world politics. And secondly is the safeguarding of national interests. So even when there is pressure, on India, whether it is climate change or its other issues, we basically continue to adopt an attitude which safeguards India's national interests. So non-alignment belonged to a different era. Today, we're in a different world altogether.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Emily, it's your turn. Where are you based, Emily? And can you take the mic and switch on your camera, or do you want me to read your question?
I am here. I don't know if I can share my video. Oh, yes. Hello.
Okay. Where are you based?
Oh, this is not great. I am from the US and I'm currently in Turin. I'm not in class today. I'm a working student. I have to do both at the same time, but I'm so happy that it's on WebEx, so I can do a little bit of everything at the same time. My question for you, I was really interested when you were talking about the recruitment, I think it was a visa program for skilled Indian workers, and I wanted to learn more about if you think that's like the beginning of something you see as a growing trend, a need or a want to recruit more skilled workers from India, or maybe is there some hesitancy and the effects that could have or might have on EU-India relations?
Thank you, Emily. Okay, very good question. See, I think what we have to understand is that Europe is aging, and it is aging fast. I've lived in Germany for 3 years and overall in Europe for a long time. So, and in fact, I'm going to be teaching in Poland next semester. Now, an aging Europe means that either it has to in-source immigrants or outsource services. Now, even Germany requires about 200,000 immigrants every year just to maintain basic services. You forget about the huge shortfall in skilled labor. I mean, you see, there is a huge shortage of skilled manpower, especially in IT and other professional services. Now, you see this as a phenomenon across Europe. And the basis for this is being laid by the large number of social security agreements that India has concluded with a number of European countries. So first of all, this began with the Scandinavians, who are generally more liberal about this. So you had Denmark, Sweden, making offers to Indians because, I know this typical joke in Silicon Valley that if you went to a bank for a loan, the manager would ask, either in Indian or Chinese, if you say that, then it's easier to get the loan. So, I mean, the Indian expertise in IT is well known. So the process began with the Scandinavians. Then the second thing which you found was that you had a large number of Indian software majors establishing offices in Central Eastern Europe, recruiting local talent because, it was easy to service West European markets because the flying time was less. You could do in-house servicing, didn't have visa problems, and also because, residents of these countries had the language skill sets where they could service these markets. The Czech Republic is very interesting because, you have that, this was a sort of a path-breaking movement. But, the Czechs were amongst the first to address this, it's to address this need in time rather than waiting for. And it's not large numbers, but what is significant is 500 for the Czech Republic is a very large number. I see this growing over a period of time, though you will find a bit of political resistance because you have illiberal governments in many European countries. And, the right wing tends to equate this with immigration, though, the numbers which we are talking about is limited because these people are coming for short intervals. They are not immigrating to permanently live in that country. They would come for short assignments, though some of the Scandinavians are offering long-term residencies. So I think this trend would grow in the future, given the reputation and qualifications of Indian software and IT professionals. And I think the good news is that one of the biggest problems in the India-EU FTA was the Britishers. And one of the major sticking points about allowing greater mode for travel was because the British felt the largest number would be coming to English-speaking country like the UK. Now, this is out of the table, which means that an agreement with the European Union becomes more feasible. As you're well aware, the European Union already has what is known as the blue card, but definitely, you need easier norms, like social security agreements. So discussions are ongoing with the European Union, but the basic problem is lack of consensus amongst the 27 member states, which makes it difficult to reach an EU-wide agreement soon. So for the time being, the arrangements will be based with individual member states rather than the European Union.
For your answer.
Sure.
Thank you both. And okay, let's see if there are any other questions on the chat. Oh, here, yeah, there is a question here. Can you use your device or? Okay, Gregoire, please.
Thank you for your lecture, Professor Jain. I'm Gregoire from France. My question deals with energy and defense. So as far as we can read on the European Commission website, there is a chapter dedicated to the environment within the connectivity partnership between the EU and India, which doesn't include nuclear energy. But you stress the fact that France has been among the first European stakeholders to promote this partnership. And I guess that my question is a very French one within the European context. Basically, how is nuclear energy perceived in India, considering its dual use? First, the civilian one. Does India rely on nuclear energy as a rather clean and sustainable energy, which could be legitimately part of the energy mix in the coming decades? And consequently, is India going to cooperate with European nuclear firms? And second, considering its military dimension, is India going to rely on the nuclear deterrence for a long time?
Thank you. Okay, thank you for the questions. Okay, let me take the easy answers first, okay? First of all, nuclear energy is viewed as a very important component of India's energy mix. And that was the key purpose behind the Indo-US nuclear deal. which was given formal approval by the International Atomic Energy Agency in 2008. Now, the basic advantage or gain of the Indo-US nuclear agreement was, number one, India was having major problems in acquiring nuclear fuel to run its reactors. With the deal having been agreed upon by the IAEA, by giving, recognizing a non-NPT signatory, this was a huge gain because now Indian atomic power plants need not be short of processed nuclear fuel. India has a very major program for, building nuclear energy plants, increasing its share in the energy mix, because as renewables are becoming more and more expensive, it is no longer sustainable, not only because of its high price, but because of its polluting nature. It is viewed as though it is initially very expensive, and while India has its own indigenous capacities to build plants up to 400 megawatts, but we seek to establish larger plants. And this is only going to be possible with, European, Japanese, and other companies, because that is the only way where you get the complete equipment. Now, it is my understanding that the nuclear energy agreement with the European Union negotiations were concluded over a year ago, and we were awaiting its formal signature. But because of the pandemic, this has been pushed to the near future. So maybe next year we may sign the nuclear energy agreement with the European Union. There were certain protests within India, especially near the Kundakalam nuclear power plant, which subsequent events revealed were done by external pressure groups and so on. But nuclear energy is viewed as a very safe, mechanism to give energy. Now, about your second question, so we are cooperating with France. In fact, the cooperation with France dates back many decades ago, but also with other, we are receiving nuclear fuel from a number of countries. As to your second question, will India give up nuclear deterrence? You see, India's problem is, India unfortunately cannot choose its neighbors. India is surrounded by a nuclear weapon power to its west and a nuclear weapon power to its east, with both of which we do not have very friendly relations. And with China, you saw that in June last year, there was, armed clashes in Ladakh. So India is going to retain its nuclear deterrence capabilities, which we are gradually expanding with our indigenous capabilities. Because, after the 1974, more especially after the 1998 nuclear tests, there were intensive sanctions which were imposed upon India. Though India now is a member of both the MTCR, the Wassenaar Agreement, and so on, except the nuclear suppliers group, we are a member of most of these groups. But our nuclear doctrine states that it is a no first use doctrine. We will not be the first to use it. Ultimately, it is, that security is going to be based on mutual deterrence, and, our stockpile is not increasing that much. So, we are driven by compulsions to maintain a nuclear deterrent. I'm afraid we have no choice about this. So this is going to be maintained and refined as we go along.